In the heart of a brutal snowstorm on Highway 70, a simple black waitress with just $47 left to her name faced the hardest night of her life. Her husband was gone. The bank was days away from taking her home. And yet, when 15 frostbitten members of the Hells Angels knocked on her diner's door asking for shelter, she didn't hesitate. She let them in, fed them with the last meal she could afford. No questions, no judgment, just kindness. What happened the next morning? Let's just say, the roar of hundreds of motorcycles outside her home changed everything. "What the hell is this?" Sarah's voice cracked across the empty diner like a dropped plate. She was holding her pay envelope already torn open, already counted twice. The bills inside were crumpled like trash someone had balled up and tossed at her life. $47, she said again, louder this time. "Larry, this can't be right." There was a clang from the back, the sound of a pan being dropped carelessly. Larry appeared from the kitchen, smelling like grease and cigarettes. He had that look again, the one that said he was already tired of hearing her voice. "That's what it is," he muttered, wiping his hands on a filthy towel. "I've been here 6 days a week. Doubles. You docked my hours again, didn't you?" Her voice wasn't angry. Not really. It was more like something old and frayed finally giving way. Larry didn't even pretend to care. "It's what the till allowed," he said flatly. "And frankly, you should be glad I keep you on at all." "You mean after 10 years of breaking my back in this place?" she said, the envelope trembling in her hand. "For this?" He stepped closer now, smirking like a man who thought he had all the power in the world. "You're lucky, Sarah. Ain't many folks willing to hire a mouthy black woman past 50 who moves like her knees are made of gravel." She blinked. Hard. Larry leaned in, voice low. "You want more? You get younger. Or you get out." That was it. That was all it took. She didn't say another word, just turned and walked out the back door, fists clenched so tight the paper cut her palm through the envelope. Outside in the frozen alley, she leaned against the brick wall and finally let go. It wasn't just the words. It was years of pushing through, of carrying trays and swallowing comments and missing rent by inches. It was the smell of her husband's hospital room. It was the mortgage notice taped to the fridge. She didn't sob, didn't wail, just cried. It wasn't just the money. It was everything. 2 years ago, Sarah had held her husband's hand as he died in a hospital room that smelled like bleach and defeat. Robert had always been the strong one. He believed in fixing things: cars, old radios, broken fences, people, even cancer at first. When the diagnosis came, they mortgaged the house, took out a loan they couldn't afford. He was going to fight it, beat it. He didn't. And now she had a house she couldn't keep, a loan she couldn't pay, and a stack of medical debt that outlived the man it tried to save. She took the bus home that night like always after staying late to scrub the floor Larry wouldn't pay a cleaner for. It was snowing lightly by then, the sky thick with it. Her boots left wet shadows on the linoleum as she entered the kitchen of her little home. The lights flickered when she turned them on. Wiring Robert never got the chance to finish. On the fridge, the notice still waited bright yellow, like a warning flare. Final notice, foreclosure, in 7 days. Sarah took it down and sat with it at the kitchen table. Just sat. No tears left now. Just the deep, cold stillness that settled when you'd already cried enough to last a lifetime. She showed up the next day anyway. Larry didn't say a word when she clocked in. There were no customers. Nobody wanted to drive into the Colorado mountains when the storm warnings were already out. The wind screamed around the building, rattling the windows like angry hands. The neon sign buzzed faintly over the doorway, the O in open, long since dead. Sarah poured herself a stale cup of coffee and took it to booth 4, the one Robert always liked. He used to sit there reading road maps, planning their someday trip across the country. She hadn't touched the seat since he died. Today, she sat. The bitter coffee burned her throat, but she didn't notice. By 8 o'clock, the snow was coming down so thick the gas pumps out front looked like tombstones buried under white. That night, the storm came in fast. Snow hammered the windows. Wind screamed through the cracks in the diner's frame. By 8 o'clock, the place was dead quiet, not a single customer in hours. Sarah had cleaned the counter twice, then wiped down the coffee maker just for something to do. The world outside was a sheet of white. The neon open sign flickered like it might give up too. She was just reaching to flip the sign when she heard it, a distant sound, low and rhythmic. Not the plow, not a truck. Deeper. Engines. She stepped to the window, heart starting to beat a little faster. At first, all she saw was fog and blowing snow. Then lights. Headlights. Moving in tight formation. Sarah counted them slowly, one by one, as they came into view. 15 motorcycles riding 2 by 2, barely visible in the swirling snow. They pulled into the parking lot as a unit, the glare from their beams cutting through the diner like searchlights. It filled the room with harsh white light like a sudden interrogation. She stepped back. Her fingers curled around the edge of the counter. She'd seen biker clubs in movies, heard enough stories, and these men, she could tell they were all men, even through their winter gear, looked like something that walked out of a nightmare. Leather jackets with gang patches, boots that stomped with purpose, helmets that kept their faces hidden. They moved like they owned the ground they stepped on, like they weren't used to hearing the word no. The lead rider dismounted first, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a calm presence that somehow commanded the rest without needing to speak. He took off his helmet, revealing streaks of gray and a thick black beard. His eyes scanned the diner and landed right on her. She stepped back again, breath shallow. Her hand hovered over the light switch. She could have flipped it, locked the door, pretended she hadn't seen them, let them move on to someone else's problem. But then she noticed something strange. The lead rider, he was limping, just slightly but enough to see. And behind him, a few of the others were moving stiffly too. One held his side. Another clutched his hand like it had gone numb. They were tired, frozen. These men had been riding through the storm for hours, maybe longer. The leader stopped at the door, gloved hand resting on the handle. Through the glass, Sarah saw his face clearly now. Older than she thought, maybe mid-40s. Eyes worn down by years of road, of cold, of things that didn't need to be spoken. They were eyes that recognized pain in other people. He knocked 3 times, not loud, but firm, respectful. She looked toward the counter where her coat still hung, the envelope with $47 tucked inside. She thought of the foreclosure notice, the landlord's threat. Her husband's voice echoed faintly in her memory as if he was still sitting in booth 4. Keep the light on, baby. Always. Someone might be out there who needs it. She moved slowly, feet heavy, and unlocked the door. The cold slammed into her instantly. Wind. Ice. It felt like stepping into another world. The man stepped in, covered in snow and grit and exhaustion. His leather jacket was stiff with frost, his beard white at the edges. I'm Jake Morrison. We're part of the Thunder Ridge chapter heading back from a memorial service down in Denver. We've got cash for food and coffee, and we won't cause any trouble. We just need somewhere warm to wait out the storm. Sarah looked past Jake at the group of men removing their helmets. They were a terrifying sight. Beards, tattoos, scars that told stories of violence and hard living. Hands that looked like they could crush bone. Faces that had seen the wrong side of too many fights. But she also saw something else, exhaustion that went bone deep, the kind that came from fighting the elements for hours on end. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. These weren't Sunday bikers in novelty jackets. These were real. One had a death's head patch. Another's jacket read Hell's Angels across the back like a warning sign. Everything in her said to be afraid. But they weren't shouting, weren't barging in, weren't threatening. They were waiting. Still. She met the leader's eyes again, tired, yes, but hopeful, like someone who still wanted to believe in the kindness of strangers. How many of you? She asked, voice flat. 15, he said. She didn't answer right away. just stepped aside and let the door swing wider. "Come in," she said. The cold still clung to her skin when she walked back behind the counter. The air inside was warmer now, filled with the sound of boots, scraping jackets, rustling the gentle creak of leather as the men found seats quietly around the diner. No one spoke unless they needed to. No one demanded a thing. Sarah moved on instinct, grabbed the coffee pot, checked the burners, pulled out the old mugs. Her hands shook a little, but not from fear anymore. It was something else. Something heavier. She'd just poured the second mug when the old landline phone behind the register lit up its red button, blinking like a warning. She knew that number. Larry. She picked up without a word. "You out of your damn mind!" His voice barked through the receiver, louder than the wind outside. "I just checked the cameras. What the hell are all those scumbags doing in my restaurant?" Sarah kept her eyes down. "They're freezing, Larry. They needed a place to wait out the storm. I don't give a damn if they're icicles. You get them the hell out of there. Now. You hear me?" She didn't answer right away, just glanced up at them. These worn-down men with haunted eyes and frostbitten fingers. Some were huddled near the old heater. One had taken off his gloves and was blowing on his hands like he hadn't felt his fingers in hours. The youngest one couldn't be older than her own grandson, looked like he was about to fall asleep sitting up. Sarah Larry snapped. "You listening?" "I'm not throwing them out," she said, voice flat, calm. "They ain't done nothing wrong." Larry let out a laugh, sharp and mean. "They will. You wait. They'll rob the register, tear the place up, maybe worse. And when they do, don't come crying to me. They're human beings, Larry. Cold, hungry, like anyone else." There was a pause. Then his voice dropped low, tight with anger. "You disobey me again, you're finished. Don't expect no final check. I'll make sure you never work another counter in this state." That hit different. Not because she believed him. She knew Larry was all bark and belly, but because she realized in that moment that it didn't matter. She had nothing left to lose. Her house was days from being taken. Her husband was gone. Her knees ached every morning. And now she was being told to choose between keeping a paycheck that wasn't even enough for heat or throwing desperate men into the snow like garbage. She looked toward the back door, then toward her coat. Inside the pocket, still folded, still warm from her walk, was $47. The last of it. She turned back to the phone, her voice steady now. "After tonight, you won't have to fire me. I'm done." "What the hell does that mean?" "It means I'm going to use my money to feed these men," she said. "And when I close up, I'll leave the key under the mat like always. You can find someone else to scrape your grease traps and clean your lies." Then she hung up. Didn't wait for him to scream back. Didn't need to. The phone was still buzzing when she walked out the door and into the storm, her scarf pulled tight. Her eyes narrowed against the wind, heading straight for the little gas station 2 blocks down, where the clerk still took cash and didn't ask questions. She came back 20 minutes later, cheeks red and arms full. Bread, eggs, 2 cans of beans, a pack of sausages, powdered soup mix, and coffee. All of it steaming in her hands from the effort. She didn't explain. Just walked into the kitchen, tied her apron back on, and turned on the stove. The snow hadn't let up. If anything, it had thickened a steady wall of white pressing against the windows, like the mountain itself had decided to come down from its peak and remind everyone who was in charge. Inside the diner, though, it was quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like a held breath. Sarah moved slowly behind the counter, hands trembling slightly from the cold that still clung to her skin, but more so from the weight of everything that had just happened. The groceries she'd bought with her last $47 were already half prepared, a pot of soup simmering on the back burner, a few links of sausage browning gently in the pan, and slices of day-old bread tucked under a towel warming near the heat lamp. She didn't rush. There was something sacred in the slowness, a kind of quiet defiance that said even now, with nothing left in her pocket and everything to lose, she would do this right. Not fast, not sloppy, but right. The men hadn't touched anything. They'd taken their places like respectful guests, not rebels, not outlaws. They sat spread out across booths and stools, Heavy coats, still on gloves, tucked in pockets, some with their backs to the wall. Out of habit, a sign of men who'd lived through situations where trust was a luxury. Not one of them raised a voice. Not one reached for a napkin without looking around first. She glanced at them. These strangers wrapped in leather and road dust marked by age, muscle, and ink. And instead of fear, what she felt now was something quieter, something closer to recognition. "Coffee's hot," she said simply, her voice more gravel than silk these days. A few heads turned. Nods were exchanged. One man, tall with deep lines carved into his face like weathered bark, rose from his booth and approached the counter with the careful grace of someone twice his size. "We appreciate it, ma'am," he said, voice low like the cold had scratched something permanent into his throat. "Don't ma'am me," Sarah replied, setting down a mug and filling it nearly to the brim. "I've been slinging hash in this place longer than some of you've had tattoos. Just take the coffee and sit yourself down." A faint ripple of chuckles passed through the room, not loud, not rowdy, but honest. The man smiled and nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She let that one slide. It was Jake who came forward next. He hadn't said much since they arrived, just enough to introduce himself at the door, enough to show he was the one they followed. He had a presence about him, not in the loud way some men did, but in the way a still lake could reflect the whole sky if you looked just right. "Name's Jake Morrison," he said, easing onto the stool near the register, his back stiff from the cold, or maybe just the years. Sarah didn't stop what she was doing, her hands still moving between the soup pot and the bread, but she tilted her head just enough to show she was listening. "We're Thunder Ridge chapter," he continued. "Was in Denver for a memorial. An old friend passed. Cancer." At that word, her hands paused mid-stir. Jake noticed. His voice softened. "He fought in Nam, like most of us. Like your husband, if I'm not mistaken." She turned to face him fully now, the ladle still dripping in her hand. You knew Robert. Jake's eyes narrowed slightly like he was staring into a foggy memory. "Robert Williams. Bobby. Drove the deuce and a half. Denver boy, right? Skinny always had a deck of cards in his pocket." Sarah nodded slowly. "He was my husband. Passed 2 years ago." Jake sat back, the weight of that name settling into his shoulders. "Hell," he muttered. "I didn't know. I hadn't heard." "He talked about you," she said. "Said you pulled him out of a transport when it flipped in Laos. Saved his damn life." Jake gave a sad half-smile. "Funny. I always said he saved mine." The air between them shifted after that, not softer exactly, but less uncertain. The kind of silence shared by people who had both lost something they never really got back and knew better than to pretend otherwise. "You were family to him," she said, finally setting the ladle down. "I didn't know he'd found his way home," Jake replied. "Didn't know he found you." "He did," Sarah said. "And for a long time we made it work. Until the world reminded us it doesn't always care how hard you try." Jake nodded. He didn't need her to explain. Men like him had lived long enough to understand the spaces between words. One by one, the rest of the men started to relax. They removed jackets, carefully placed gloves near the heating vent, and eased into the cracked vinyl booths like old dogs finding a familiar spot on a porch. The warmth in the room grew not just from the stove, but from the way they moved. Respectful, measured, even graceful in a way that didn't match their appearance but made perfect sense if you watched long enough. The one with the mohawk held the door for the youngest Danny, who still looked like he hadn't shaken off the cold from outside. Another man, Marcus Sarah would learn later, made sure the chairs weren't blocking walkways. One of the older guys even pulled a napkin from the floor and folded it before sitting. They acted like men who had been turned away before, like they understood the cost of being welcomed. Dinner was plain, but hot. A few cans of soup stretched thin with water and seasoning. Sausages split and fried in a worn cast-iron pan. Bread crisped just enough at the edges to smell like effort. There was no dessert, no menu, no promises. Still, the men ate like it mattered. No one asked for seconds. No one criticized. When Sarah passed by with a fresh pot of coffee, more than one pair of eyes lifted with quiet gratitude, not just for the drink, but for the fact that she was still serving. Because they knew, all of them, that she didn't have to. Later, when the plates had been cleared and the quiet murmur of card games replaced the clink of spoons, Sarah sat on the stool behind the counter and looked around her diner like it had become something else entirely. 15 strangers, a busted freezer, $47 to her name. And yet somehow she didn't feel poor. "You remind me of my son Marcus," said, softly breaking the silence. Sarah glanced up. "Which one?" He gestured toward the young man dozing near the window. "That one. Danny. Same look when he was that age. All bone and pride, trying to act like the world didn't scare him. Where is he now, Afghanistan? Third tour. Comes home next month if God still listens." Sarah set her mug down. "Robert always said war makes boys grow up too fast and die too young." Marcus nodded. "Or come back old and don't know how to be young again." They didn't say more. They didn't need to. Danny stirred near closing time. The wind outside had gone from angry to tired, a slow moan pushing against the walls like it had given up trying to get in. He rubbed his eyes, looked around, then stood and approached the counter like he was walking into church barefoot. "Ma'am," he said, voice quiet, cracking at the edges. "You probably don't remember me." She looked at him, really looked, and for a moment something did flicker. A memory faint and half-formed. A younger version of this boy alone, eyes too hollow for his age. "I was here 3 years ago," he said. "January. My folks had thrown me out. I'd dropped out of school, lost my job. Bike was falling apart. I had $5 to my name and nowhere to be." Sarah didn't speak. She just listened. "I was gonna give up," Danny continued. "Had a motel key in my pocket and a plan that wasn't gonna take me past morning." He swallowed hard. "But you gave me a meal. A hot one. Pie, even. Wouldn't take my money. Said I looked like I'd had a rough day and that sometimes not knowing where you're going is the first step to finding where you belong." He wiped at his eyes with the back of his sleeve. "You gave me a business card for a guy in Salt Lake City. Said he might know someone who'd hire a kid who didn't know what the hell he was doing." Sarah blinked, memory rushing in like light through a cracked door. "I took the job," Danny said. "That man, he became like a father to me. Got me back on my feet. Got me around these guys." He looked around the diner at the men who had become his brothers. "You saved my life, Miss Sarah. Not just with food, but with kindness. With a little hope when I didn't have any left." The room went still. Even the heater seemed to hush. Sarah felt her throat tighten, not with sadness, but with something older, heavier. Like grief and grace rolled into one. She hadn't remembered him. Not fully. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that once upon a cold night she'd done what felt right. No fanfare, no reward, just a plate, a kind word, and a card from her husband's drawer. And it had made a difference. A life-sized one. Jake stood, then his mug empty, but his eyes full. "You've been a light on this highway longer than you know," he said, his voice like gravel and warmth. "We came in from the cold tonight looking for coffee and shelter. What we found was a home." Sarah didn't reply. Couldn't. Instead, she reached for the coffee pot, refilled his cup, and whispered, "Help yourself to the cream and sugar. I've got more bread in the back." Sarah had never liked silence, not this kind anyway. The kind that fills a room after something's been said that can't be unsaid. The kind that isn't empty but so full it presses against your skin like weather, like weight. She stood behind the counter, her back stiff and her hands wrapped tight around a half-clean mug as the last of Danny's words hung in the air like a note still ringing long after the piano lid's been closed. "You saved my life, Miss Sarah. Not just with food, but with kindness." He wasn't crying anymore. The boy, though, his eyes were red and his voice still shaky. He'd said what he needed to say, then sat back down near the window without asking for more. That's how you knew he meant it. Sarah hadn't moved for a full minute. Not to answer, not to speak, not to blink. The other men, big as they were, rough as they looked, didn't fill the silence with laughter or shoulder slaps or some half-hearted, "Ain't that something?" They just sat with it, quiet, like they understood it deserved space, like they'd been there themselves, held by a stranger's kindness when the rest of the world had let go. And maybe that was it, Sarah thought. Maybe that was why they were here. Not because the storm forced them off the highway, but because something else had brought them back around some unfinished thing between one good deed and one long debt. It was Marcus who finally broke the stillness. He leaned forward in his booth, calloused hands wrapped around a chipped mug of lukewarm coffee, and looked toward Sarah with eyes that weren't young, but still carried their weight without apology. "You probably don't remember me," he said, his voice lower than before, rough around the edges like someone who hadn't spoken gently in a while. Sarah looked at him and shook her head. "I don't," she admitted with no shame in it. "It was maybe 10-11 years ago," Marcus continued. "Middle of January. Blizzard kinda like this one. My daughter. She was driving back from Denver State, wrecked her car somewhere near Silver Ridge. I didn't know where the hospital was, barely knew what direction to go in." He paused, squinting toward the corner of the diner where the old payphone used to hang. "I stopped here. You were working. Your husband was still alive then. You gave me a coffee, told me to sit for a minute, then circled the quickest route to the ER on a napkin and said you'd keep a prayer going till I called back." Sarah felt something flicker in her ribs. A vague memory, a man with a wind-burned face holding onto a paper napkin like it was scripture. "She made it," Marcus added, his voice softening. "They said if I'd gotten there 5 minutes later, she might not have." Sarah didn't speak, just nodded. From the back of the room, another voice joined in gravelly, almost hesitant. "You gave me soup when my bike broke down." The speaker was Pete, the man with the sun-bleached ponytail and faded denim stitched with half a dozen patches. Middle of a snowstorm. Didn't ask for my name. Just fed me and let me sleep near the heater till the weather passed. "That was Robert," Sarah said softly. "He always said if we had heat and coffee, we had enough to share." Pete nodded, smiling a little. "Hell of a man, your husband." There was something in the way they spoke his name that made it feel like he hadn't gone too far. Like he might still be in the back, checking the oil on the fryer, listening through the wall, and smiling that crooked, quiet smile he wore when something good was happening. Carlos was next. 5 years ago, my daughter got into a wreck outside Denver. I didn't know what hospital she was at. I was too mad, too scared to think straight. You let me use your phone, the old one near the window, and you packed me a sandwich and some fruit before I even realized I hadn't eaten all day. "I do remember you," Sarah said, and she did a man with cracked sunglasses and shaking hands who couldn't stop looking at his watch. "You left your wallet here." Carlos chuckled. "And you mailed it back. With a note. Said, you looked like you had more important things to worry about." He cleared his throat and rubbed the back of his neck. "I still got that note. It's taped on the inside of my garage." One after another, the memories came. Not grand speeches, not dramatic confessions, just small truths spoken plainly. A man remembered Sarah calling a tow truck when his engine died and refusing a tip. Another remembered how Robert had once changed his tire in the dead of night with nothing but a flashlight and a grin. Someone else recalled Sarah keeping the place open an hour late when a young couple came in off the road with their baby wrapped in a motel towel. None of it was written down. None of it had made headlines. But it had stayed. In them. In here. And now in this frozen night it came back like warmth, thawing through the seams of something that had been cold too long. Jake hadn't spoken through any of it. He just sat at the counter a little off to the side, listening with the kind of stillness that didn't ask for attention. When the stories slowed, when the quiet crept back in, he finally rose from his seat, walked over to the payphone that no longer worked, and stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets back to the room. Then he pulled out his phone. Didn't say a word. Just stepped outside into the storm, the door shutting behind him with a soft click. Sarah watched him through the foggy window, saw him pacing back and forth, boots crunching through ice and snow. He wasn't yelling, just talking. Long calls, short ones. She couldn't make out his face through the glass, but something in the way he stood, shoulders squared, head high, told her this wasn't just idle conversation. This was a man working something out, and whatever it wasn't small. "Who's he calling?" Sarah asked quietly. Marcus leaned forward, resting his forearms on the counter. Old friends, contacts, other chapters, maybe even some folks who owe him a favor. Sarah blinked. Why Marcus gave her a look, not smug, not knowing, just honest. Because you gave more than you got. And Jake ain't the kind to let a good debt go unpaid. Jake didn't come in for nearly an hour. By the time he did, his hair was wet and his jacket stiff with frost. He stamped the snow off his boots without a word and walked straight to the counter where Sarah was refilling mugs. Tomorrow morning, he said simply, maybe sooner. Sarah looked at him, her brow knit tight. What's tomorrow? Jake just smiled, small, tired, genuine. Just don't lock the door. She wanted to ask more, wanted to press, but something about the way he said it, quiet and certain, stopped her. And maybe for the first time in too long, she let herself believe that whatever it was, it might be good. That night, she didn't sleep. Not a minute. She sat behind the counter, an old blanket across her lap, watching the men sleep like dogs curled in safe corners. Big shoulders hunched, boots unlaced, breaths deep and even. They looked younger this way, not like outlaws or misfits or men with rap sheets longer than their regrets, just tired men who'd made it through another storm. She refilled the coffee, pulled out extra mugs, turned down the lights, and somewhere deep in her chest where grief had carved its deepest hole, something stirred. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was close. It was the beginning of something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. Hope. It had been a long night, the kind that doesn't end when the clock says it should. Sarah hadn't slept not a minute. The silence in the diner broken only by the soft rhythm of breathing, and the occasional creak of a booth under the weight of a sleeping man felt almost holy, like the walls had gathered it all in, held it close. She'd watched them, these weathered men with steel in their bones and road behind their eyes, drift off one by one, jackets over shoulders, hands tucked into sleeves like boys huddled at a church sleepover, not outlaws resting in a stranger's grace. And she had sat behind the counter, cup after cup of lukewarm coffee, cradled between hands that had once held a life with a man now buried beneath the kind of quiet only grief understands. By the time the first dull edge of morning light began to reach through the window blinds, Sarah felt like she'd aged another year, not in pain, but in something closer to understanding. Some nights teach you things sleep never could. She didn't want to leave, but she knew she had to. The road back home was slow, not because of the snow, though it was thick and stubborn as ever, but because of the way her heart dragged behind her. She walked that morning not with urgency, but with the measured gait of someone who knew where she was going and feared what she'd find when she got there. The storm had softened just enough to let sound carry, and her boots pressed into the snow with the kind of weight only exhaustion and dread can bring. As her house came into view, she stopped. At first, she thought she must have been mistaken, some illusion brought on by sleeplessness or snow glare, but the sharp glint of metallic blue and the outline of heavy boots told her otherwise. A white van sat parked just outside the gate, its logo unmistakable. Sunbelt Credit Recovery Services, along with a second vehicle. This one black and marked with yellow tape along the mirrors, the kind used by third-party contract agents, the kind that didn't ask questions if you offered them an extra $50 to be fast. 3 men stood in front of her home, one in a suit and wool coat that looked like it cost more than she made in 3 months, and 2 others in plain jackets with bulked shoulders and dark expressions that spoke of boredom and muscle memory, not compassion. Sarah's heart caught behind her ribs. They were already at the door. "Ma'am," the suited man said without even waiting for her to get closer, his voice high and clipped like he practiced it in front of a mirror. "You were sent final notice over 2 weeks ago." He waved a stack of papers without actually offering them the way a magician distracts before the trick. "According to the foreclosure agreement, this property is no longer legally yours, and we've been authorized by the county and the issuing bank to proceed with seizure and immediate inventory of any remaining items of value for assessment and liquidation." He said it like he was reading from a brochure. Sarah looked past him toward the open door and saw one of the other men already carrying out a small box. The old photos, she realized, the ones from the bottom drawer, the ones she hadn't touched since Robert passed. Her legs didn't buckle, but they almost did. "You're trespassing," she said, but it came out too quiet. The suited man raised an eyebrow, not out of concern, but amusement. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but you don't hold legal right to this property anymore. We are acting fully within legal enforcement protocols. Now, if you'd like to avoid a public incident, I suggest you stand aside while we complete this process." She took a step forward anyway, and then another, but she wasn't shouting, not pleading, just walking toward the pieces of her life that were being handled like junkyard scraps. One of the movers set a box on the snow-covered lawn. It tipped slightly. The lid flapped open, and a photo frame wooden carved by Robert's hand one Christmas tumbled out and hit the porch hard, the glass cracking down the center like lightning frozen in place. Sarah bent to pick it up, fingers trembling. The frame was still warm from the inside air, and when she turned it over, her own face stared back, young, smiling, wrapped in Robert's arms beneath the old red tree on Elm Street. She hadn't seen that picture in years. Her throat tightened, but still she didn't cry. Not yet. "Ma'am, I must ask you to vacate the property immediately." His voice was sharper now. He thought he was being disrespected. He thought this was about inconvenience. And maybe it was in some rooms for some people. But not this room. Not this house. Not this woman. And just as Sarah opened her mouth whether to protest or collapse, she still wasn't sure something happened. A sound. Low at first, then building. A rumble. A vibration beneath the snow. She turned her head, instinctively, eyes scanning the horizon, and there, cresting the hill that led down into the little cul-de-sac of tired homes, came the first bike. Then another. And another. And then dozens. Hundreds. The noise came fast, a wave of engines, the kind of sound that doesn't just hit your ears, but your ribs, your teeth, the soles of your feet. They came in black and chrome, in red patches and American flags, some with handlebars so high they looked like towers, and others with sidecars packed with gear and people. The entire street shook. The air trembled, and the bankmen froze. Sarah stood still, the cracked photo still in her hands. The suited man turned eyes wide, uncertain now, and took one step back from the porch. From the middle of the storm came Jake. He pulled off his gloves slowly, one finger at a time, as he walked toward the group, a line of riders fanning out behind him in a semicircle that blocked the van, the movers, and every exit out of that yard. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He walked up to the suited man, stopped inches from him, and reached into his coat. The man flinched just barely, and Jake paused, letting the moment hang in the air long enough to be noticed. Then, from inside his jacket, Jake pulled out a thick, weathered envelope, rubber-banded, bulging. He tossed it at the man's chest. The envelope hit hard enough to make the man stagger slightly before catching it. 15,000, Jake said. Cash. In full. Backdated interest included. You get your commission, your bank gets its pound of flesh, and you get to walk away with your teeth in place. The man blinked. You can't just... A second man, broad-shaved head, arms like hams, stepped forward from the left. You can stay and argue, he said plainly, or you can leave and breathe. The suited man took a long look around at the bikes, the patches, the boots crunching in place, and stepped back. No trouble, he muttered. We're just doing our job. Find a new one, Jake replied. Within minutes, the vans were loaded back up this time with nothing from Sarah's house, and the men were gone. No final words, no signatures, just retreat. And when the last taillight vanished through the curtain of snow, the only sound left was the quiet settling of 100 engines cooling in the cold. Sarah still hadn't moved, still held the broken frame. Jake approached her slowly, his voice low, almost tender. "Sorry we were late," he said. She looked up at him finally, tears welling, but not because she was broken, because she wasn't. Not anymore. Jake reached into his other pocket, pulled out a single folded sheet of paper and handed it to her. She took it with shaking hands, unfolded it, read the first line, "Transfer of ownership, Stone Ridge Diner, parcel MR07 11123 405. Her breath caught. Jake stepped closer, voice soft now. "We bought it. From Larry. Signed yesterday morning." He didn't argue. Sarah stared down at the paper, reading every word, even though her vision blurred with tears. "We want you to run it," Jake said. "Not as an employee, as family, a home, for us, for you, for anyone lost enough to need a place like that again." The paper trembled in her hands. "I don't know what to say." Jake smiled. "Then don't. Just say yes." She did, with a nod, with a hand over her mouth, with the tears that finally fell, not bitter, not angry, but grateful. And in that moment, surrounded by the so-called worst kind of men, Sarah felt more protected than she ever had behind any lock under any roof. As if called by fate, the sound of more bikes came from the road, more riders from more places. Salt Lake, Phoenix, Nevada, Texas. Riders who knew the legend. Riders who had been waiting years for a reason to repay the woman who'd fed them, helped them, saved them, whether she remembered their faces or not. They didn't come for revenge. They came for redemption. They came for Sarah. And now, as the sun finally broke through the thick layer of storm cloud, casting a soft gold over the snow, someone whispered the name like it meant something sacred. The Angel of Highway 70. And this time she didn't argue. They called it Midnight Haven now. The old place had kept its bones, still sat squat and proud at the edge of Highway 70 like a dog that wouldn't give up its patch of sun, but what stood there now was more than just a diner. It was a patchwork stitched by calloused hands, rebuilt in pieces by those who knew what it meant to come in from the cold, to be fed without question, to be seen without judgment. 6 months had passed since the storm. Long enough for the paint to dry, for the floor to stop creaking, for the wind to find its new way around the widened porch and added side garage. But not so long that folks had stopped asking every time they stepped through the door if she was here. She always was. Sarah stood behind the counter like she had for 20 years, though now her apron was black instead of faded brown, with a clean embroidered patch over her heart that read, Angel of Highway 70. At first, she'd protested the name, called it silly, said it made her sound like a ghost. But over time, the name settled on her like the old cardigan she wore every winter, familiar, well-earned warm. She'd pour coffee, like always, sliding chipped mugs down the counter like she used to back in her 20s when she worked the night shift at the truck stop off I-25. She didn't move fast anymore, not since the arthritis settled into her hands last spring, but no one minded. The ones who came here weren't in a hurry. The walls had changed. Gone were the peeling laminate menus and dull family portraits with faces no one remembered. In their place, photos of bikers and drifters, truckers and nurses, soldiers and strangers. Every picture had a name and a date beneath it, sometimes a short note, sometimes a joke only they would understand. One corner of the dining room had been turned into a memorial for Robert, her late husband, his old war medals in a glass box, his favorite flannel jacket hanging like it was waiting for him to come in from the cold. And next to it on the wall, a quote Sarah had picked out from an old notebook he used to keep. "Kindness don't cost nothing, but it'll pay you back when you need it most." She read it every morning when she unlocked the front door, and again every night when she turned off the lights. They came from all over. Some rode in alone, others in groups, engines thundering in the distance like an approaching storm that never quite broke. Folks from as far as Nevada and Texas, and even a couple from Canada, all with stories, all with reasons. They didn't just come for food or warmth, though God knows the meatloaf and cornbread were reason enough. They came for something quieter, something older. They came for the feeling that there was still a place in the world where the lights stayed on, and someone gave a damn if you came through the door. Sarah never asked for their names. They offered them anyway. Danny, the youngest of the group that had first come through during the storm, now handled most of the daily operations. He still had that nervous energy about him, still wiped down the counter twice when once would do, still checked the receipts like he thought he'd find something new. But his shoulders had squared up some. His voice had steadied. He didn't flinch when the coffee pot hissed too loud anymore. He called Sarah ma'am the first 2 months. Now it was just Miss Sarah. Sometimes when she wasn't looking, he called her mom. Marcus had kept his word too. Brought his son by not long after he returned from overseas. The kid Evan was lean, sharp-eyed, and quiet in a way that didn't come from shyness, but from having seen things too early. He shook Sarah's hand like he meant it, then hugged her before she could pull away. Dad says you're the reason he made it through that last year. She didn't know what to say to that, so she just pressed her hand to his chest, right over where his dog tags used to hang, and whispered, "I'm glad you're home." He cried, but didn't wipe his face until he got back in the truck. They weren't all bikers. Not anymore. Some were women, some were couples in beat-up minivans, some were older than Sarah herself, and still rode cross-country because no one told them to stop. There were families, small ones, broken ones, who came for one night and stayed for 3. A retired nurse from Missouri brought a box of canned goods and stayed to help stock the pantry. A vet with a limp offered to fix the leaky faucet in exchange for coffee and a warm place to sit. No one asked them to. They just did it. That was the rule here. If you came in peace, you were home. Some nights when the wind picked up and the CB radio buzzed with chatter from the highway, Sarah would step out back and just stand under the stars, letting the cold nip at her cheeks, while the hum of the diner filtered through the walls behind her. She'd look up at the sky full of stars and whisper Robert's name, not because she was hoping for a sign, but because saying it kept him close. Sometimes she'd say other names too, names she didn't know, names of people she'd fed, housed, hugged, or buried. One night in late September, the rain came down hard. Not snow this time, not yet, but a soaking rain, the kind that clung to your bones and made the walls hum. Sarah was wiping down the counter lights, dimmed low, most of the riders already asleep in the back rooms or curled up in booths. The CB crackled to life. Breaker 19. Midnight Haven. "Y'all read me?" She reached over, thumbed the mic like she'd done 100 times now. Her voice came out smooth, calm, even a little amused. "Go ahead, road dog. Haven's listening." There was laughter on the other end. Salt Lake. Chapter 30. Bike's strong. We're about 20 miles out, got a couple new boys with us. Hope you got coffee on. She looked around the empty diner lights. Warm floors, clean soup already simmering on the back burner. She smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was perfect. "Coffee's hot," she said. "Lights are on. Doors are open." She paused, then added what had become her ritual. "And you know what that means." Family's home came the answer. She set the mic down gently and walked to the window. The rain streaked the glass like tears. She looked up past the reflections of the booths, the neon open sign, the old clock that ran 5 minutes slow, and her eyes landed on Robert's picture right where it always was above the service window, smiling at her in that quiet way he always had, like he knew what she was about to say. She said it anyway. "You see that, honey? You were right. This place, it really is special." Her voice cracked a little, but she didn't wipe her tears. Didn't need to. The truth was, this place had never been about the food. Not really. It was about what came with it. The pause, the warmth, the seat that didn't ask for a story, just offered a cushion. It was about second chances and late-night conversations. About knowing you didn't have to be perfect to be welcome. And maybe that's why people kept coming back, because someone remembered who they were before the world told them they weren't enough. One afternoon, Danny asked her if she ever thought about retiring. She just laughed and said, "Retire to what I already live in heaven." And maybe she did. Not the kind with harps and gates and white robes, but the kind built with hands and sweat and pie crusts and grease. The kind where nobody had to knock twice. The kind where even ghosts felt safe to rest. And every night, as the last pot of coffee cooled and the last booted step walked out or settled in, she'd turn off the radio, lock the front door, and whisper the same thing she had since that stormy night months ago. "Good night, Robert." The light's still on. And somewhere in the quiet, she trusted more than most people she knew he was smiling. You know, writing this story wasn't just storytelling. It felt like soul-telling. Midnight Haven isn't just a place on a map or a diner in the snow. It's a symbol of kindness, of found family, and of how much impact a single act of warmth can have in someone's life. Sarah didn't have much. Heck, she barely had enough to get through the week. But what she did have, empathy, dignity, and the will to do what's right, turned a dying diner into a sanctuary. This story reminded me that kindness doesn't need permission. It doesn't wait for perfect timing. It just shows up. Sometimes in the form of hot coffee on a cold night. Sometimes in the roar of engines arriving when all hope feels lost. And Jake Marcus. Danny, they're proof that redemption's real. That people can carry scars and still choose to protect, to serve, to love. We live in a world that moves too fast, forgets too easily, and judges too harshly. But this story, it slows us down. It asks us to look again at the people we overlook. The waitress, the old biker, the runaway kid. It asks us, who would we become if we chose compassion first? If this story touched something in you, your heart, your memory, or even just your hope, I'd love to hear it. Drop a comment below. Tell me what part hit home for you. And hey, if there's a Sarah in your life, maybe send them this story, because some people need reminding. The light's still on, the door's still open, and someone still gives a damn. Thanks for listening, friend. I'll see you in the next one.